The Second Great War, as most of us know, brought clashing in a variety of ways, perhaps the mightiest states the world had ever seen. The devastating dynamo that was the German war machine pressing forward against the immense titan which was the Soviet Union. The Germans also needing to contend with the globe-sprawling British Empire and rising superpower of the United States, all of whom remained very weary of one another's ambitions. The French, who had initially challenged Germany's expansion alongside Britain, were quickly knocked out of the game in a swift German invasion, leaving behind only ragtag resistance forces and minor British assets stationed on the continent, before themselves being driven out not only there but throughout the whole of the mainland, from Norway to Greece. Britain would thus be forced to combat Germany by sea, by air, and in far-off lands, doing whatever possible to hinder German success. But beyond merely impeding German efforts, the British would remain determined to regain continental ground, and specifically, to liberate France. As the Germans grew confident of Britain's limitations, but anxious of the Soviets' rising capabilities, so was attention shifted eastward, bringing the formerly opposed British and Soviets to a mutual understanding through sheer necessity. The war would wear hard on the USSR, whilst Britain had yet to break the mainland, even now with American support. Although victories had been achieved in North Africa and other parts of the Near East, such had not been sufficient to slow Germany's eastward advance, leading Stalin to demand of his allies that a western front be opened to mitigate the great strain placed upon the Soviet Union. By 1943, ground had finally been taken in Italy, who soon surrendered only to come under German occupation. Geography and a series of German defensive lines would make Allied advance through the peninsula a great challenge, thus a quicker, more strategically significant front needed to be opened, and the answer would finally present itself as an invasion of the French beaches of Normandy, an effort commonly known as Operation Overlord, or simply D-Day. The Normandy invasions proved to be a great turning point in the conflict, not only in a strategic sense, but in boosting Western morale as well. The seeming impenetrable Atlantic Wall meant to lock out the British had been broken, the Germans no longer secure on their western front struggled to hold off advancing armies from east and west, and Vichy France was abandoned so that troops could remobilize closer to the German border, in essence surrendering the French south to the Allies. While Italy might have held off an Allied invasion of Germany for another year or two, it was clear to quite a few in the German high command that if northern France was successfully taken, the war would certainly be lost, and so it had been. The allies of the West and East converging upon Berlin some months later, defeating Germany and bringing the European theater of the war to a close. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline the D-Day invasion had failed? It hadn't been an outcome far out of the realm of possibility. General Eisenhower even drafted a letter of regret in which he would assume full responsibility for the operation's failure if in fact things did not go according to plan. The Germans as well had long exaggerated the strength of the Atlantic Wall, which proved to be to their own detriment, as because Britain held air superiority, they were quite capable of evaluating German defenses beforehand, whilst many German commanders were simply lulled into a false sense of security as to the fortifications of the Western Front. The key exception had been General Erwin Rommel, who'd been sent to inspect and improve upon current coastal defenses. He'd conclude that the Atlantic Wall was, at best, 18% finished, and hurried to install additional measures, although resources were in great part siphoned off to other areas of the war. Germany also had an opportunity to strategically station a number of tank divisions in preparation for a crushing counterattack. However, these forces had been split three ways, with only one division actually in place to counterattack on the first day. We'll assume things go a bit differently this time, be it through a more effective fortification of the Atlantic Wall, or some other factor which leaves the Allies at a disadvantage. By some means, the invasion is simply repelled. The Allies immediately feel the impact of this loss as plans are scrapped and internal divides grow wider. Some have assumed that given the tremendous loss of life even in our own timeline, a defeat at Normandy would lead an ashamed General Eisenhower to resign, something backed up not only by the letter in which he assumed full responsibility for the outcome, but by the fact that he had been losing his patience with Britain and had threatened on 2 occasions to return to the US. Whether or not Eisenhower does resign, the severity of this loss does certainly follow him in his post-war years, costing him any major chance of winning the presidency in 1952. Speaking of presidency, this loss would also harm Roosevelt during the 1944 election, just some months after the planned invasion. While Roosevelt is still likely to defeat Dewey simply based on historic public support for an incumbent president during wartime, he does do so by a much narrower margin, potentially setting Dewey up for a victory in '48 when he goes up against Roosevelt's former Vice President Truman. Although there'd been a mutual understanding of Normandy's value, the operation had greater support from Roosevelt than it did Churchill, who instead favored attacking the Axis from the more vulnerable south. a region he termed Europe's soft underbelly. It was because of this that Operation Overlord, originally Operation Sledgehammer, was meant to coincide with Operation Anvil, later renamed Operation Dragoon. As the names might suggest, the plan had been to capture southern French ports to establish a sturdy base, and to come down upon German forces through an overwhelming northern push, like a hammer striking metal on an anvil. Logistic issues made the coinciding plans impossible, and so Dragoon was carried out sometime following Overlord as a standalone operation. In our world, the effectiveness of Operation Overlord demanded that Germany pull the majority of its forces in the south to instead hold off the advancing allies. Thus, when Dragoon was carried out in the south, it was met with relatively little resistance, and proved an overwhelming success. However, because the allies are repelled in the north, the south remains well supplied, meaning if Dragoon is carried out, it could still prove a disaster for Britain, whose population had already been, as Churchill himself supposedly put it, running on fumes. Considering the great toll the failed Normandy invasion had brought, Britain may hesitate to attempt a second invasion even in the less defended south. Dragoon had after all been a compromise between the US and UK as to an invasion site, but if we assume that 1. American involvement would be compromised by Eisenhower's departure, and 2. Britain is less willing to attack a risky target, the outcome might instead be to launch an invasion of the oil-rich Balkans from Italy, as Churchill had originally planned. Stalin strongly opposed this as he asserted it would intrude upon his sphere of influence. However, this was precisely the reason Churchill insisted on such an operation, understanding that he could cut Germany off from petroleum assets and thus significantly weaken them, as well as place the West in a more advantageous negotiating position with the Soviets post-war. It's reasonable to assume this invasion would go along much easier than its alternatives. However, the matter isn't so much if it can be done successfully, but what reaction the USSR might have to it. If we assume the British invasion of the Balkans takes place around the same time Dragoon was carried out in our world, this would lead the British to directly encounter Soviet troops along the eastern Serbian border, just as Bulgaria and Romania fell under Eastern occupation. The plan at that point would be to advance northward toward Austria and Hungary before pressing forward toward Berlin. This change of strategy would no doubt drive divides between the Allies, including the US and UK. Roosevelt, not taking kindly to Churchill's domineering oversight, perhaps shifts attention toward the war in the Pacific instead of the Balkan campaign. If so, this would drastically slow Britain's advance, allowing Hungary and even Austria to fall to the Soviets, making the invasion ultimately pointless. Alternatively, as to not tread heavily on Stalin's toes, Churchill might instead opt to invest more heavily in aerial bombardment. Chief Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Arthur Harris, had been a strong believer that tactical bombing raids on German cities would ultimately bring about a surrender. As we know from our timeline, a German surrender did not come easy, and it's unlikely mere bombing raids would achieve a victory for Britain. However, there's much opportunity for this to have become perhaps one of the darkest outcomes for the war. By 1945, France is still under German occupation, and rockets continued to strike Britain even despite misinformation tactics which at least managed to keep many from striking London directly. The Soviets without Western support continued to advance slowly but surely, although the current pace might indicate another year or two before the war is over. Stalin, frustrated with the ineffectiveness of Britain, is no longer expected to remain within his sphere of influence, leaving Britain desperate for any alternative. In our world, Churchill had wrote to his military chiefs, quote, "I should be prepared to do anything that will hit the enemy in a murderous place. I may certainly have to ask you to support me in using poisonous gas." This proposal had been made exactly 1 month following the D-Day landings, and speaks quite a bit to the desperate state Churchill had already been in. He would write further, "We could drench the cities of the Ruhr and many other cities in Germany, and if we do it, let us do it 100%. His military chiefs initially rejected the proposition, fearing German retaliation in equal or greater scale, not to mention the public outrage that would come from such an action. Churchill, however, simply responded, quote, "I am not at all convinced by this negative report. The matter should be kept under review and brought up again when things get worse." Eventually, the consideration began to approach reality. An earlier initiative known as Operation Vegetarian, which involved infecting the German food supply with an anthrax bioweapon, was revived in the form of using anthrax bombs against 6 major German cities. The plot was only abandoned because by the time the bombs were ready, the war was nearly over. This time, things are different. Much like the US in the Pacific, the British are growing weary while their adversary remained unshaken. Bombing raids and invasion proved too slow a strategy, and so drastic measures were taken. Unlike Truman, there's much doubt over how hesitant Churchill would have been to unleash his own weapon of mass destruction. As far as he was concerned, there was little difference in using such weapons in this Great War as earlier versions had been used in the prior Great War. As you might expect, the effects are devastating. The 6 German cities targeted are rendered uninhabitable, but this attack doesn't end the war just yet. It's believed that the Germans had by 1945 stockpiled some 80,000 tons of chemical weapons in the event one of their opponents used WMDs first. Had Britain initiated this exchange, Germany would unleash its own arsenal of far deadlier agents against both Britain and the Soviets. It's not clear who would come out on top in the aftermath of such a situation, if the three would agree to a ceasefire and ultimately resolve issues diplomatically, or if the Soviets, through benefit of being so distant from the battlefield, might take advantage of the situation to exert influence over the weakened Britain and Germany, or perhaps Britain remains untouched as Germany is unable to effectively deliver their weapons overseas. Whatever the outcome, this would be one catastrophic possibility. But let's backtrack a bit and consider the British invasion of the Balkans once again. Let's assume that the US continues to back Britain just to ensure the Soviets don't overwhelm them completely and demand more than previously negotiated. Major oil fields in Romania, just as in our world, are still captured by the Soviets on account of proximity and an unwillingness to allow so close a state to fall under Western influence. This increased effort in the south may hinder Soviet advance in the north, but only minimally. Western efforts are in great part wasted in the Yugoslav region, which would have come under control of Tito's partisan forces. This does, however, allow for a British occupation of Albania before it fell to communist insurgents. The speedy victory in Yugoslavia also becomes a springboard from which to invade Austria and Hungary, aiming to sweep westward and retake Belgium and the Netherlands, whilst the Soviets approach Berlin, bringing the war to a close. While this plan of invading the Balkans just to circle back around to France might seem convoluted, it plays best to the strategy the Western Allies would have had to adopt. A march toward Berlin could be attempted, but given the pace at which the Soviets were closing in, it may prove a safer strategy to capture well ahead of where the Soviets might intend to expand. France couldn't be secured through direct invasion nor routing through Italy, and so rather than take France back before war's end, the West would simply need to block it off from Soviet access and return to finish the job once the war was over. Because of the southern route taken by the Allies, occupation zones are divided diagonally along a northeast-southwest line, with communist Yugoslavia being a key exception. The Yugoslavia of this world could end up divided in two, with a socialist republic along the coast and a kingdom more inland, simply because the Soviets are never able to link up with the partisans in this timeline due to Western occupation. Albania is also placed in a dual monarchy with Italy as to secure it from its larger neighbors, something which had originally been considered years prior, and which formed part of the official basis for their annexation by Italy in 1939. Hungary, Austria, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic are maintained within the Western Bloc, along with southern Germany, however at the cost of the Scandinavian countries which came under Soviet occupation following efforts to neutralize their pro-German governments. Sweden, though neutral during the war, and Finland having earlier negotiated peace, would still fall under hefty Soviet influence and see favor for Communist parties rise through both legal and social pressures. The delayed Western support of this alternate world also discourages the Soviets from major involvement against Japan, leaving the Pacific War to rest in great part upon American efforts. Now, it's been suggested by some that the impending threat of Soviet conquest had been what truly motivated the Japanese to surrender, and while there's partial truth to this, the strains which drove Japan to this desperate state came primarily from US actions. The Soviets breaking their pact of peace with Japan had been startling, as the Japanese North went largely undefended in order for resources to be diverted against the US, meaning Japan was woefully underprepared to fight in this new front. The Soviets had also captured one of Japan's last major resource hubs, leaving them without the means to fuel their war effort. You might even say that the USSR's entry into the war with Japan had been an Eastern equivalent to the D-Day invasion. That being said, Japan had been running on fumes since late 1944. Resources, manpower, and naval weaponry were nearly depleted. All possible courses of action appeared bleak, leading to much disagreement within the high command and restlessness from within the Japanese population. Something only escalated by the dropping of the atomic bombs, impending threat of American invasion, and an overall lack of preparation on the mainland islands. The military was tired, the people were tired, and even the emperor was tired. As one Japanese admiral had put it, the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war are, in a sense, divine gifts. This way we don't have to say that we quit the war because of domestic circumstances. Given the lack of incentive, the Soviets might delay their invasion until the end of their peace pact with Japan, some 9 or so months after the invasion had begun in our world. The end result being that the US would occupy much of Japan's captured territories, with the exception of a few islands which Stalin had asserted claim to during the earlier conferences. Because the Soviets don't invade Japanese conquests in northern China, it remains outside of communist control, thus when the resumed Chinese Civil War begins, the communists are left without the safe haven provided to them by the USSR in the north, ultimately allowing China to return to nationalist rule. While the Soviets are now more strategically positioned within Europe, the Asiatic communist sphere which had emerged in our world never forms. Indochina may remain under French control for a time, although the US would certainly take an active stance against both British and French colonialism, much as in our world. The Roosevelt administration and its successors had pushed the anti-colonial agenda since the outbreak of the war, the US making clear plans for ensuring self-determination in all post-war countries, although Churchill for a time asserted that this would only be the case for states under Axis occupation. These plans likely wouldn't change even if we assume Dewey beats Truman in the '48 election, as Dewey represented the pro-internationalism moderate faction of the Republican Party, which would later come to form the Liberal Republicans. Britain and France, who are now in a more compromised position due to the USSR's expanded influence, are more reluctant to give up what were a tremendous source of wealth and resources, which would be direly needed to rebuild. We might imagine the US withholding aid from the Marshall Plan or imposing upon the two some form of economic penalty should they refuse. India, Morocco, Tunisia, and Indochina likely still break away, however the two empires would grasp tightly upon the remaining territories, not trusting the US to fully ensure their security in the event of a Soviet attack, looking to each other instead. Without the industrious lands of northern Germany, France and the Benelux countries are short a major member of what would have been the European coal and steel community. This alternate timeline might see Britain assume a leading role in what Churchill once described as a United States of Europe, or perhaps merely a Franco-British Union, operating as a third faction in the Cold War which represented the interests of Europe free from both American and Soviet domination, as well as pursue the continued success of the imperial and colonial systems. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.